We're here for today, hopefully what you guys are here for is to find out about this GAship program. And so this is has come from a partnership between the University of Hawaii and Army Natural Resources program. And the idea is there's a lot of specialized research questions that will support the program, but it's often hard to frame these for these national competitions and things like that, because the problems are so specific to Hawaii, and some of them are so specific to Oahu and the places and species that they're managing. So the purpose of today, just to kind of give an overview of the program, kind of a broad sweep, and then talk about some of the applied research needs and just present what this opportunity is, right? So, and if you guys have any questions, you can drop them in the chat. You can unmute yourself. Again, it's such a small group. Feel free to kind of treat this casually. Hang on a sec here. So just a little bit about my background. As I said, I'm Clay Trowernick, and I work in NREM, so I'm at University of Hawaii faculty. I do extension, and part of this partnership between UH and the program is kind of launching this extension program to target ecosystem conservation and restoration specifically. So some of you might be familiar with the work I've been doing about the past decade in fire. And JB is also on the call. He does as an extension program in forestry. The idea here is we're getting information out to folks that need to sort of address these practical problems in the field, but also, just as importantly, trying to make sure that the research that gets done at the university is addressing those needs, right? So it's kind of creating the space for this to have this back and forth. And of course, there's a huge problem across the state that this applies to. And so we've got some sort of programs on the extension side that are trying to address this statewide. So just a little bit of an overview, some of the things that we're kind of have in the works. So predator control workshop. We've been developing these county-specific weed management workshops, which has sort of been carrying the torch that James Leary, another former extension person in our department, had been undertaking. And then also we covered technical training and methods. We're kind of looking at developing some weed control sort of workshop and learning materials, and some restoration strategies, things like this. So pretty broad, but the research effort that I've been trying to dive into for starters has really been targeting ANRPO. And so that really connects us back to what we're here to talk about today. And as I said, Jane and Joby, if I mess up any of this stuff or there's stuff that I missed, don't be shy. But basically, ANRPO is mandated to protect endangered species, right? So there's a bunch of endangered species across Oahu that have been directly impacted by training impacts by the military. And the real gory details get into a fire that happened in Makua some years back. But that was really the genesis of this thing, that the Department of Defense was sued for starting this fire. It had impacted these endangered plants. And in response, the Army was required to basically start this program, to fund this program. And so this is the purpose of stabilizing these endangered species. And they have been doing this. The program's been doing this since 1995 was the first field staff was initiated. So they've been doing it for quite a while. And as you'll see, the program has grown quite a bit since then. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar, on Oahu, there's a bunch of Army training areas. And these are all different combinations of leases and ownership. But there are endangered species on all of these lands. Fortunately, I would say, unlike some of the archaeological work, the training isn't necessarily directly impacting these things, but as part of that decision, they have to protect species that kind of lie outside of these direct impact areas, right? So they've got a whole bunch of management units that kind of span mostly in the Waianaes, right? So kind of the full range across the Waianae Mountains, but there's also several in the Ko'olaus and in wet forest. And so, a wide variety of habitats, climate types, even for our little island of Oahu, there's kind of quite a range of taxa and ecosystems that they're dealing with. 51 rare plants, and what we're really talking about here is stabilizing those populations. And so they've got really specific targets mapped out for that, like how many individuals, how many populations, right? And then what are you trying to do to control the threats around those populations? And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. Endangered bird, they work with the Oahu Elepaio, and again, trying to control threats, especially during their breeding season, monitoring the populations. The Elepaio is kind of a bright spot for conservation on Oahu, and it seems to be that the populations are kind of expanding across the Waianae Mountains. They're all over the place. And endangered tree snails, that might be on the opposite side of the spectrum as far as a real challenge, right? And so most of these are actually been moved into these enclosures that prevent predators from coming in and knocking out these populations. So a lot of really interesting dimensions with the tree snails. And then several insects, so that trying to get our heads around as far as management, but really just trying to track, identify where they are. So picture wing flies, or Drosophila, the damselflies, yellow-faced bees, and there's some interest in Hawaiian hoary bats, although at this point, apart from kind of avoiding breeding season, chopping down trees and things, there's not really any specific management actions taken for those. But yeah, avoiding, impacting those populations, and we're starting, I would say, like kind of starting to be at the cutting edge of intervening to support the invertebrates. A lot of this is really threat control, what we're talking about. So, there's fires that impact, especially in some of the lower places in the Waianae's, lower elevation spots. And so that's really, there's a lot of restrictions that are involved around training and where they're allowed to train and when they're allowed to train. And there's a big outreach arm of the program, which kind of tries to educate folks on base, especially some of the leadership, about the importance of this kind of work. And then, what a lot is dealing with vegetation, right? So invasive species control, a ton of effort is into managing not only invasive plants and weeds, but rats, slugs, all these things that impact these areas. And then, of course, ungulates, and that really comes into the fencing. So all of those management units that I put up on the map have fences. Those need to be checked quarterly, right? So, and all of this maintenance, and make sure that they're not being breached by pigs or goats. And then the snail enclosures is kind of a whole other dimension of sort of predator-proof fences, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. By far, I think it's pretty safe to say, I think Jane and Joby, you'd agree that the bulk of the effort in the field is weed management, right? So trying to control incipients. So these are new things that are kind of popping up on the map and we get worried about. And then just the sort of standard threats like guava, tuna, these sort of trees, and other understory weeds, clydemia, that just you need to keep them out of native areas to keep them in good nick. And then the program manages what I've been told are some of the largest rat trapping grids in the nation, right? So relatively huge areas of rat trap grids. So they use these A24 automated traps that really knock these back. And I have to say the results from this kind of efforts, both the weeding and the rat trapping, I mean, you're seeing regeneration in some of these valleys and gulches that they're managing that I just haven't seen anywhere else, at least on Oahu, where you're seeing common plants come out of the seed bank. It's pretty amazing what can be done. And then the invertebrate threat, right? So slugs are a big one, especially for seedlings coming up, especially some of the lobeliids seem to be pretty sensitive to that. Coconut rhinoceros beetle is unfortunately spreading, and we have had detections all the way across, up pretty high up into the mountains at this point. And then ants are one that we're still trying to figure out what are the consequences of ants that are just widespread throughout these ranges. And then the other cool thing that's, I think, more of a recent development with the program is full-scale habitat restoration, where these guys are going into full, like, wall-to-wall guava and knocking it out and actually reestablishing kind of from the ground up native ecosystems. And so this is something you can see it pretty widespread on the Big Island, where you're going into maybe some old pastures and things like that and establishing native forests. But this is pretty much chopping down what's there, these guava thickets, and having some really cool outcomes as far as intensive weed replanting, outplanting, and weed maintenance after that. So yeah, here's kind of the breakdown just to give you guys an idea. Invasive plant management kind of takes the top. But there's also a lot of data that gets collected, a lot of monitoring that goes on, tons and tons, I can speak from personal experience, of data to sift through and sort through. A lot of potential to look at, long-term monitoring plots, population fluctuations with some of these invertebrates, for example, as well as the rare plants. So lots of cool data. A lot of this sort of coincides with the rare plant and other, kind of goals that they're trying to do. So like the invasive plant management is obviously tied to maintaining and stabilizing rare plants, but this involves kind of like seed collection and then, reintroducing to new sites or augmenting existing populations. A lot of time on greenhouse. So there's 2 greenhouses, or there's 2 full greenhouses. You guys might have more grow space than that. But a giant seed lab, right? So making sure that we're storing genetic representation of especially these endangered species, but also collecting commons that sort of get going to the greenhouse and get put out to restore ecosystems. And then all of these other actions that kind of get stacked up on top of that. So you've got your tree snails and the fly monitoring the invertebrates. The small vertebrate control that's kind of across all the MUs, and then dealing with some of these other impacts that are kind of emerging. And then, as I said, there's a whole monitoring program that kind of is tied to a lot of this stuff. So not only monitoring what's happening, the vegetation change, but also like what's the success of the rat trapping, kind of what are the levels that we're seeing of these threats in the management units, and then a big outreach arm as well. And I'm like trying to move this thing so I can see the rest of this table. Let me just, an ungulate control that's really backbound to fencing and keeping those fences maintained and removing them if there are breaches. All right, I'm just going to kind of move along here. Pretty full on structured program here, so you kind of have a lot of going on. There's 57 positions right now. I think that's gone up and down over time, but you kind of have a pretty solid organization. So where there's field teams that are in charge of various management units, there's a vegetation restoration team, and so those are kind of the folks that are really dealing the day-to-day work out in the field, kind of doing the weeds and fence checks and things like that. And then you've got a kind of conservation program where you have people that are specializing in your some of the taxa, so the snails and rare plants, and as well as the threats, right? So predator and ungulate biologists, things, and then you have your horticulture team, so the folks in charge of figuring out what plants we need to propagate, what plants should get going out and where, and then actually growing those plants out in the greenhouse. And then all the folks in charge of the monitoring and data, managing all of this stuff is it's a lot of work. And so there's a bunch of people that do this. So it's probably, I don't know if it's safe to say, it's like got to be the biggest conservation program in the state, I mean, outside of Division of Forestry and Wildlife. So as far as these proposals are concerned, this kind of gives you that overview. I should stop and just check if there's any questions to begin with. But does anyone have anything, or Joby and Jane, is there anything that I missed? I know it was kind of ripping through there. Okay, they're shaking their heads. Sorry, let me go back. So what you can see is there's a lot of taxa, there's a lot of kind of threats to manage and different dimensions and aspects of protecting these taxa. I mean, there's some real fundamental questions of sort of like across all these tasks, right? Like where should our effort be distributed, right? And that's kind of some big picture questions, but there's also a lot of nuts and bolts practical questions that could have big impact for a lot of these species. And so that's really the point of putting this GAship out there to support the program and really tailor some research projects towards these applied needs that they have. And so just to give you an overview, of course, if you're on this, it means you got the details for the program, but you can find more details. This is on my FIRE website, where so you can, at that website is where all the details are, but it's basically for the graduate faculty to submit. So we're not trying to discourage students at all from thinking about projects, but we really want you to work with your advisor, right? And so to have some, so you guys are looking at this together and putting that in. And then the deadline is kind of short, but it's also not a super involved proposal. It's only 2 pages, right? And maybe some additional information, references, and a budget. But it's a 2-page proposal. It's due on the end of the month. And they have funding right now for 2 awards. And those can be up to 2 years of support. So the way that this would work is if you get awarded, that is an 11-month graduate assistantship at SEP 12, and then 1 month of faculty summer salary. And what we've talked about this year is that we're making that summer salary have some flexibility, and if there are material, because we don't support at the beginning of this, we've been doing this for 2 years now. We did not provide materials and supplies, but if you as a faculty member would like to or be okay with taking all or a portion of the summer salary, you can split that out and use that to cover other costs if you need. And then, of course, the additional support that the program can provide, I would say, reasonable, within reason, time from their staff to kind of address questions and kind of help work through some of these problems and make sure that the questions are tuned to their needs. And then, of course, access also within reason to the sites. I mean, they're getting out to these sites on a monthly basis, more or less. Not all of them, but most of them. So, that's pretty easy to facilitate as far as getting into the field with the teams. And of course, lots of facility and sort of the greenhouse, between the greenhouse and seed storage, there's a lot of materials at the base yard that would support research, and what they have done in the past, like providing plant material, for example, to look at pollination, things like that. And then the timeline for the project itself is we want to give the faculty really time if you need to recruit students, which is also part of the reason for that short turnaround, is if you want to recruit new students or you don't have students in your lab that are interested in, to give you time to do that. These would be starting in the fall of 2023. So you would start fall 2023. That first year would cover you right through the summer, right? And then if you're applying for 2 years, we would require an annual report, just like update. And so pending on like your progress, then you have a second year, but like contingent on sort of satisfactory performance over that first year. And any questions about that? Yeah, Corey.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Not about what you just covered, I don't have a question, but regarding that breakdown that you showed of the staff times allotted to the
Yeah.
different aspects of management actions, I'm curious for Joby and Jane, if you off the top of your head have ideas on where you would like to see times allotment increased or decreased? I mean, I imagine invasive plant management, obviously you want to decrease it, but just curious if you guys had target numbers or ballpark numbers for those.
Not really target numbers.
Oops. Your audio just cut out. I don't know
Nope.
why.
It does that if you
Okay.
does that some should be.
No,
How's that?
that's working. Just hold still. Hold your
No,
body
nobody
very
moved.
still.
This is from 2018, 2019. I just redone this last week actually for another visit from some other people, and the numbers are really very similar over like a 3-year period, which was a little surprising to me because we don't crunch these numbers all that often at like at this scale. We do it kind of at a smaller scale. But the rat number actually, Corey, is interesting. That number has changed. The 824 is those automatic traps that like cut our rat staff time almost in half, which was great. And if there was a way that we could do the same kind of invasive plant control with half the time, that would be incredible, right? Because you can see we spend as a program, we spend like a third of our time on invasive plant control. Yeah, the ungulate one is an interesting one. When we were doing installations, there was a huge amount of effort done in putting up fences, but now we're just like Clay said, in like a management, repair, maintain kind of a cycle. So that one has been pretty flat at 3 to 4%. But as far as big gains, I think you're right. And Jane will obviously have some opinions here too, but it'd be great to save time on invasive plant control because that is the hugest thing. But that's all about, I think, new tools, and that's probably not going to be changing fast.
I guess just one other thing to add is, and I don't know in the literature if other organizations have kind of looked at their time breakdown in a similar way. And I think for us, running these numbers was interesting because we aren't quite sure what the goals should be. Like, how much time should we be spending on slugs and other invasive invertebrates versus weeds versus something else? And so I think in part it was like looking at these numbers was a little bit of informative, just thinking like, oh, okay, well, maybe invasive plant management is always going to be the most labor intensive, and we just need to plan that into our workflow. But yes, I would actually be interested to see what other organizations do, and are we in line, are we out of line, and how that works. I think everything that we do, of course, if we can do it with less effort, that means we can protect more areas and work in more sites, but work with more species. But yeah, I think that's where our what we would use our gain for. But right now, the weed control is the hardest one to find big gain.
Yeah, that's
for the question. That was a
great.
good one.
Yeah, great question. Andrea, do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm new to this program, so this is super helpful. Thank you for having this presentation and discussion. I have a few questions, if that's okay, having to do with what the needs really are. So I saw that you had provided a PDF table of areas of need. And there are many needs. Some of them seem to overlap with programs that I know exist in state agencies like DLNR. So for especially some of the insect programs. And so I'm wondering if, I guess if do those needs change year to year? And is the sort of idea to partner either with staff at ANRPO or with other government agencies in coming up with these projects?
Yeah, just to wait, we'll get into some of the needs, so that if you're wondering, like, to go, we'll cover that next. But yeah, that's a great question. Go ahead, guys.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, I think there are a ton of needs, and I think that kind of reflects that research needs list. Like, we kind of brainstormed that within our program, but I think a lot of agencies will have similar questions, and there definitely is a lot of overlap with other agencies that work with the same species. So we work with the state insectary, DOFA, quite a bit, and I think those are questions we've working group meetings on, like Drosophila management, and they're things we all are interested in. So I think that, for research projects, it wouldn't just have to be limited to working with us. It would be awesome to have work with our partners at the state as well. But I think that's my answer. Before I ramble, yeah, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I work a lot with the SEP guys too, the snail guys on all stuff. So definitely, those are pretty general questions, and answer them, not for us, but for everybody. So we dragging anybody and everybody that's interested in combating some of those things into the discussion.
I guess one thing on the, how up to date these questions are. So there's always going to be a lot more research and questions, and there's time to answer them. So I guess our research needs list hasn't changed a lot from last year, but we have added a couple things, and I'm guessing we will add things in future, and we've taken a couple things off as well, which is wonderful. So it's not that it's a static, unchanging list, but I think that just kind of reflects that there are so many questions and so little time to delve into them.
Thank you. If I could just follow up really quickly on that. So I'm mostly done really basic research, but I'm interested in sort of channeling it towards something that is useful. And so would it make more sense for someone like me to first connect with either staff in your program or agency collaborators, and then in maybe a future year consider applying for this program?
I would say quick answer is don't wait. But also, if it would be helpful, I don't know what area of your interest is specifically, but we could pair you up. I mean, I could fill you in as much as I can, but we could fill you in with some of the staff specialists. We'd be happy to have a conversation this week or next about questions that you might have. Like, we don't want to discourage you to put it off or anything.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And any other questions before I jump to the next? It's about, I think there's a few slides left just on some of these needs that Andrew's kind of talking about. There's a lot. But you know, this kind of goes the big picture, right? There's a lot of actions and sort of goals that are across the program, and so this is kind of how we started divvy these things up, these ideas up, and I guess it helps. I think Jane and Joby probably organize who to go to within the program to kind of what those needs are, to articulate those needs, but also from, you know, our perspective, who we can direct you potentially to, right, as far as trying to get some more details about the needs. So there's also a long history of prior work, right? So this program has been supported by researchers over the years, and so a lot of kind of baseline stuff on like ants and fire and fungi, you know, so there are some published studies out there that some of these research questions are kind of spinning off of as well. So just to keep in mind that it's not just like starting from scratch in a lot of cases. So as far as ecosystem restoration, I kind of grouped these together. Ecosystem restoration and invasive plants, you know, I think this top one is actually really critical. It seems that we know what the things are we should be doing, but like connecting a direct response to that activity is pretty hard, right? So how are these species responding to these actions that are being taken, right? You have a combination of stuff happening across all these sites, and that kind of goes back, Corey, to like your question of like, what should we be doing more or less of, right? So that's a pretty critical one. It seems obvious, but that it's really difficult to actually do that. There's a whole seed zone maps that are out there that we're trying to adhere to through our restoration program. But like, does that or do we need to be so careful with that? Like, so there's these guidance where you should only collect from one zone to restore in another, you know, within that geographical space. So, you know, common garden experiments, just what kind of variability is out there and among even these common species. There's like very little information about that. Increasing the efficacy of monitoring, right? So just methods like tools, are there stuff that we should be doing that we're not? Right now, for example, we've got a project funded where they're using aerial imagery and AI to detect species detection. So that's like a projects like that are happening across multiple agencies, you know, for detection and things like that. Seed biology of invasive species is pretty huge. If you want, I don't even want to start Jane talking on incipient weeds because there's a whole lot going on there, but it's like, if you find a weed in a place that we want to get rid of and then we get rid of it, like how long do we have to keep going back to check for that thing, right? Like how long is that going to persist? How long is that threat out there for, right? And so they've got a lot of protocols that the program has developed, but like how fine-tuned are they to these taxa that we're dealing with? And then herbicide efficacy and application is always something that we're interested in. As I mentioned earlier, James Leary was a weed management specialist in our department who left for brighter, better pasture, apparently, in Florida. Like, who goes to Florida from Hawaii? But anyway, yeah, he was doing all kinds of cool stuff, and we have not replaced that position. So there's a huge need there. Rare arthropod research question. So this is really kind of, I would say, cutting edge conservation stuff. We've got Drosophila. These are like one of the big famous Hawaiian radiations, right? Adaptive radiations. And there are specific species that we're trying to protect, but what we're doing is sort of monitoring, right? Like we know we can do counts and sort of see where they are and how they're fluctuating, but we really are kind of scratching our heads about why, you know, what are the impacts of ants? What's the sort of impact of the available sort of forage and breeding material, which are like these sort of specific plants that they like to live around. Again, these host plants that they prefer, there's a lot of sort of difficult problems from a plant biology perspective of allowing those things to persist. So these things like raras the host plants themselves are rare, right? So how do we deal with that? how do we even know our monitoring techniques are good enough, right? So the baiting that we've been doing, they've been following a protocol for about a decade. So again, there's good data using that method, but maybe there's better things that we could be doing. As Jane mentioned, working with the insectivary, right? So they're actually successfully breeding Drosophila. Like, is there a way to augment these populations? The Hylaeus, that's the yellow-faced bee. I'm not sure what that status is. There's not really any direct actions for that at the moment, right? We're still sort of in this maybe survey mode, and but there's interest in, if there are methods that we could target that would increase their numbers, that's something that there's an interest in. And then damselflies are another kind of can of worms. Like, we can sort of see general habitat preferences, but like, how do you kind of intervene to increase their reproduction and improve their habitat, control threats in their habitats? Those are the damselfly, Megalagrion. Endangered plants, tons of questions. So obviously this is the bulk of the taxa that they're working with, 51 species. You know, some of these probably I would say you guys have a pretty good handle on, right? But other ones, there's still some big question marks out there. So there's some work had been done on disease resistance and beneficial fungal associations. So this is Anthony Amend and Nicole Hinson have done a little bit of this, but like, how can we kind of apply some of those findings at scale and in a field-based applications? I think there's still some questions there. Soils are a big one that comes up all the time in the field, talking with folks like, what are we like, should we be making better decisions about where to put these things? Making realistic about our expectations, and that ties back to a lot of the fungal associations. We just don't know anything about that in these forests. Cryostorage is kind of an emerging technology. So some of the plants that we're dealing with, the seeds don't store, right? So can we use cryostorage, deep freeze to preserve some of these materials to you know, in case something happens to the wild populations? And that's a lot of that work's happening at Lion Arboretum at the moment. And then increasing survival, I mean, I would add recruitment to this question, but like, what is really limiting the successful regeneration and survival of these plants in the field? And the big example, there's this Puccinia rust that just hammered Eugenias in the Colau, so like the northern end of the Colau Mountains, and you know, this program watched their population just collapse in a matter of a couple of years, right, to the outbreak of this rust. And what do we do, right? So they seem to be hanging on, so there's still individuals out there, but they're quite sensitive to these kinds of things. And that, like, you know, what next one is kind of around the corner. It's kind of depressing to think about. And then tree snails. So this is probably, I would say, the most proactive actions to protect these taxa that is happening has been really led and spearheaded by ANRPO. And so this is the one species that they're really working with, but this technique has promised to help lots of other species that are out there. But they've got these protected areas. I was telling you about these little, is it okay to use the word snail jail, or is that like... Anyway, there are these enclosures, right? So they keep the snails in and these predators out. So they're keeping out Jackson chameleons, rats, and then the big one is this Euglandina rosea. So the, I forget what the common name is the rosy wolf snail. And these, I'm like trying to explain this. You have to go out with these guys to see what it takes to keep these out before you bring in the snails into this jail, into the enclosure, sorry. You have to sweep the ground and the trees to make sure these rosy wolf snails are not in there, right? And so there's these protocols, and that takes an enormous amount of time and effort to do these kinds of things to make sure that these enclosures are intact and actually keeping predators out. And the numbers on the snails are quite astonishing as far as the collapse in the past decade or so, right? Where these things are, before these enclosures, they were on the brink. And so maybe at one point, they'll be able to like move them back out of the enclosures, but for now, this is sort of the best we can do. And that's kind of it. Those are an overview. As I said, there's a whole, or I should say, there's a whole list of these questions, probably more than we could get into. Andrea had pointed out, attached on that website. So if you want to kind of peruse that, and there's other questions after you take a look at that, don't hesitate to, you can reach out directly to me. My email is listed on that page. I can put it in the chat too. But other questions, I'm going to stop sharing here. Solomon, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Clay. I just have two quick short questions, hopefully. I was just wondering if ANRPO is specifically and exclusively interested in federally listed endangered species, or is the IUCN Red List something you guys are also intending to work off of?
Yeah, that's a great question, Solomon. I think most of the taxa that we work with are the federally listed ones. They're the ones that we're specifically kind of tasked and mandated to look at. There is a subset, well, so we have some that are specifically called it out in the Manoa-ANRPO implementation plans.
Mhm.
And I'd be happy to, we can provide you a list of those if that's helpful to look at. But then there's also other endangered species found on Army lands that aren't part of those implementation plans that we also can do some work on. We've also started looking at, there's this, oh gosh, I'm not quite sure. It's another designation called species at risk, and they are species that are not listed, but and it's, I think, something that DoD has been doing on some of its different installations, because they're trying to figure out what actions they can take that will be beneficial, and ideally, I think, beneficial to the point where the species doesn't need to be listed. And that's another list we've been working at generating. So I think that some of the IUCN taxa, there is some overlap, like they do look at that list to generate this species at risk designation. Right. So I think there is some overlap there. So yeah, I guess that's a long-winded answer. That we can look at other taxa as well, besides just listed ones.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, appreciate that. And then, yeah, my other question is if, yeah, ANRPO might be interested in like leveraging invasive like leguminous legumes to establish rare parasitic native trees. So yeah, I work on sandalwood, right? I'm kind of asking maybe a more pointed question here, but yeah, in terms of kind of the intersection between invasive species management, where there's kind of like a, scour the earth, or maybe selective felling, maybe, what trees in terms of like albizia, haulicoa, kiave, these things that we know are nitrogen fixers and are actually most likely decent hosts, at least for some Hawaiian sandalwoods. Would there be any interest in the program to do some kind of trial like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's I think for us, most of the sandalwoods aren't listed, and I'm not sure I don't know if they'd actually fall onto that species at risk list. I don't think that they were on that. So I think for something like that, because it doesn't have as much kind of like direct impact into our work, we probably, for us, it'd be kind of more peripheral. I think as well, I guess specifically for invasive hosts for something like sandalwood, yeah, there's definitely, it's great to use the alien weeds when they can give us some benefit. I guess it would be unlikely to plant them, but if they were already there, then I think that would be interesting. And definitely in the non-plant world, there are a lot of Elapaio use non-native taxa all the time. So I think there's a lot of overlap there. But yeah, I guess in terms of if your question is specifically about sandalwood, I'd say it's kind of a species we'd be we're interested in, but that we don't have a lot of direct nexus for doing kind of really kind of scale intensive research. That being said, I think we're always interested in what everyone is doing, and that if there's a way we can assist and help, we're open to hearing about it.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah, Corey, is that your hand raised?
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I was wondering how the funding works. I mean, is the expectation that the student or students would have the questions sent out by ANRPO? Would that be the entirety of their study, or I guess it would depend also if you were doing a master's degree versus a PhD, but do y'all have insight on how that's worked out so far?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that, right, like we come up with this list of research questions, but we recognize that people are looking at sometimes bigger questions, or they want to incorporate other species. So I think where our specific, in terms of any proposal, I think all those proposals, what's happened in the past, we look at them all and we try to see which one, select the ones that are going to be relevant and kind of like fit our greatest need and kind of like work well with what we need to do and what our capacity is. So I wouldn't want to discourage anyone from having a broader scope than our specific question. But I think our specific questions are definitely, I think, where we see some priority need. I guess, I don't know if Clay or Joby, you want to add anything about the funding aspect?
So far, all the ones that we've funded have been pretty much just directed to those questions, and I found plenty of material to work with within those questions.
Some of them have been broader in scope, though.
Yeah,
I'd say. Yeah.
The process, Clay, maybe you got that best, but like last year we had 6 or 7 applications, I think 8, maybe it was, and we awarded 2 of them. We reviewed them as a committee here. Yeah, we 3 last year. That's right. And then Clay administers it once the decisions are made as to which ones would be supported.
Yeah, I wouldn't say like you definitely. If you, we did have a couple applications that were for PhD students that were sort of proposing. There was one on Ferns, that one of Tamara Tickton students, where she had proposed like a component of a bigger project to look at, use some, look at on ANRPO sites. So I certainly wouldn't discourage you from thinking about, if this was like a portion, 2 years of a bigger project, as long as it's clear that, the sort of deliverables and the questions that you're going to address with that part of the funding is going to just target a need with that program. I mean, if that need extends beyond, I think a lot of them have the potential to do that, right? And of course, like the scope of the project, I think a lot of times what we actually saw proposed was like, wow, like this would be amazing. And we didn't like not select them for that reason, but it was clearly like bigger picture ideas. So I would say it's definitely worth pursuing if you can think of it as like, yeah, this is going to target this need, but even if it's a component of a bigger project.
Yeah, I just had one other thing to add, was just that, we I think GAships are one way we can kind of get involved with research, but it's not the only way. We're definitely interested in partnering in other manners, whether that's via land access or, assisting with, kind of expertise or advice or just running through ideas. We're also interested in that as well, because the GAships, it's right too, and there's so many questions, and so we're interested in talking about other ways we can support it as well.
Yeah, any other questions? Because like the only thing go ahead, JB.
I may be coming somewhat from a Big Island perspective here, but for ecosystem restoration, do you have areas where you're trying to start from, completely degraded ecosystem and restore structure and that sort of thing? So, on the Big Island, a lot of what we do for rare plants is go in and restore a common plant ecosystem, and then you can put in rare plants and maybe birds will come and all that stuff. But that basic, you've got, fountain grass and tree tobacco or kikuyu grass, and that's it, restoring something. Are there areas under your domain that you're also just trying to restore some sort of common native ecosystem that you can then put in your rare things?
Yeah, definitely. I think we have some different starting points than you do on the Big Island. We don't have as much of the grassy habitat as well. It's not totally true. We have a lot of guinea grass, which is so much fun to work in. But most of our big restoration projects have been more in mesic forest. So like Clay said, starting from strawberry guava and then rebuilding it. Those projects tend to be focused in our management units in areas where we think like if the habitat was more native, it might be appropriate for rare plants or other rare taxa. So yeah, but they are for the most part pretty small because of the labor intensive clearing and the even more labor intensive follow-up.
But
Okay,
I have to add, like, I think just seeing the operation and like the approach that they're taking, it's really cool. I mean, it's really like sort of they're trying a lot of new things, approaches to this. For example, just like going heavy understory species to start, right? Where like the traditional, like, I don't know, you plant trees and then you come back in where they're finding like if you actually start with higher understory cover, the thinking is that that actually reduces your weeding management time. So kind of getting back to Corey, what you were asking about is like, there's constantly thinking about ways to sort of reduce the effort in other dimensions, right? So that's like an outplanting strategy that actually ties back to the maintenance that they all know is coming once they cut down, once these guys start cutting down guava. So
yeah. Well, I mean, Rhonda did thinking about that with, do we want to get rid of Morellifia first, or do we want to do something that we don't just kill the Morella and then get weed, another weed problem hitting us?
Yeah, so that I mean, it's directly tied to that. It's like you just filling in the space on the ground, but it is intensive and they're relatively small scale. But a lot of restoration sites, I think across the state, start pretty small, right? You can't just clear out 50 acres and then expect to have enough plants to fill in. But all I was going to add to the whole presentation was that just feel free to reach out to me with questions, and if I'll answer what the best I can, and then if once that's passed, I've exhausted my knowledge and my ability to help, and we'll just tie you into the right person in the program, depending right on like what your question is about, what you're thinking about, and so we can just facilitate that. Don't hesitate and think you need to know everything about everything from this presentation. We can fill in some of the gaps and answer any questions that you guys would have. We just really want to encourage you guys to apply, right, and to think about doing some work with the program. And then Casey said, "Thanks, no worries, Casey. Glad you could come. You're like one of the Casey got one of the first ones to do some firework with them." So
yeah, I was just going to add to JB. I think all of the restoration work and everything that's been done on the Big Island, I think I'd love to learn more and like exchange more information as well. I think one of our biggest challenges is like how site specific everything seems to be. Like, even just in some of the weed and restoration workshops here on Oahu, when we just have different organizations talking and be like, oh, well, I'm seeing this or I'm seeing that. And it's like every site has a slightly different reaction. And it's like maybe a function of the specific species mix in that area and like the history of that area. And sometimes it's like, well, why did we see that happen at that site? And why are we seeing something slightly different happen here? And that, which has made it really challenging to, I guess, have anything that's say publishable or fully translatable to others. But I think there are some like general trends that we were able to kind of like pull out. But I think that's a huge need, how to optimize restoration, how to do restoration on a bigger scale. That's really challenging here on Oahu when you're starting with this mixed music forest or
very aggressive weeds.
Area. These so aggressive.
Yeah, even here on the Big Island, we don't see much restoration of invaded wet forests, right? It's Mauka forests on Mauka pastures on large scale, with Hakalau, the park on the thousands of acres have been turning the corner on those things. And then it's the dry forests on a pocket scale with maybe a couple acres a year. So over a decade, you've got 10 acres restored. But there's a couple incipient projects now on strawberry guava invaded Ohia forest. Wow, where do you go with that? But there aren't really good. That's not something over here we see much of either.
Yeah. So apart from the lowland areas, yeah, like those where you've just got thickets of it.
Right. So if you're given that, there's Oha just got a parcel up Waikea side that is, there's Ohia overstory, a few surviving plants, the understory, natives, and then thickets and thickets of strawberry guava. And oh my God, what do they do there? If you had your backyard of that,
Oahu, come check it out. They can see.
well, yeah, it's easier than Oahu because it's at least kind of flat. It's not like really steep.
Right.
Yeah, oh man, if you like, we actually got a wood chipper and we've flown it into a few sites because the amount of slash you create.
Yeah,
coming
I've
down
seen
strawberry
slides
guava,
of that. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, sometimes the maintenance, like getting a mechanic out into the field to maintain your chipper can be fun. If you can offer them a helicopter ride, sometimes it's a little easier. But yeah, no, I think that's where we've had the most success is strawberry guava. Things that I think are much more challenging are like restoring Christmas berry dominated, or I think the new emerging threat is, it's been here for a while, but tuna ciliata, we've seen a lot of spread of that. And that's a much more challenging kind of tree to work with because it gets so much bigger. Yeah, so just logistically, it's really challenging to figure out how to restore those areas. But
And the guava's got no seed bank. That's the wonderful thing about it, JB. Yeah, that thing that doesn't have any seeds that last for more than 6 months. So
Right.
it's horrible and then it's easy all at the same time.
Yeah, you can knock it back. Yeah, there's one landowner that I work with that has restored a 40-acre scattered Ohia ranch that was abandoned for decades and became solid strawberry guava by but I mean it was a ranch, so they could drive equipment in there, but harvesting strawberry guava and chipping it and using the chip to mulch natives, and it's a really neat project. I'll send you an email. Hawaiian Airlines did a little holo out there and did a little video. I gotta go find that and send it to you.
Yeah, send it
that'd
out.
be great. And I know we've been talking a lot about like restoration here now and stuff, but like I think just that one that like Clay mentioned, that provisional seed zones and how we ground truth that and how we determine if that's needed or not, like those kinds of questions would be great because you can't backtrack once you've planted them. You've changed that genetic structure in that area. That would potentially help a lot of agencies. And then all of the endangered species questions. I mean, there's just with so many like endangered species to look at, there's a lot from pollination,
and a lot of the taxa,
etc.
Like a lot of the taxa have sort of congeners in other parts of the islands, right? So like a lot of the lobelioids, for example, would so even that stuff, like you were kind of asking about, Corey, like it may be highly relevant to conservation of these species in the same genera and other places. So I think a lot of this stuff has application beyond the program, and so I think we would definitely encourage projects that are thinking beyond that as well. So. Well, if there's not any last questions, we'll kind of, I think we're going to get cut off at the hour anyway, but just thank you guys for coming and thanks for such thoughtful questions and discussion. And I hope you put something in. We look forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks. Bye-bye.
Clay.
Yeah, no problem.